Welcome to our video Bible study through the book of Ecclesiastes. My name is Ryan Goodwin. I preach for the East Shelby Church of Christ in Collierville, Tennessee. If you have questions or comments from our study today, then leave them in the comment section below. Or if you'd like to learn more about our congregation, you can find info at eastshelby.com. Let's have our Bibles open to Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and we're going to be looking in particular at verses 1 through 14 today. So Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 through 14. Before we get there, though, let's do a summation of some of the things that we've talked about up until this point. In Ecclesiastes, the writer's main concern is there joy to be found in this life? If you look at things under the sun, that is, things in the physical world, everything that the sun touches, is there contentment and purpose and meaning to be found in the activities of this life? So he's tried things like wealth and possessions. He's looked at human relationships. He's considered wisdom and foolishness. He's looked at posterity, or the legacy that you leave behind. He's also considered things like teamwork and society, government, and corruption, and as well as worship in chapter 5. The vanity of wealth in chapter 5 and chapter 6. And now we get to chapter 7, where I think in the first 14 verses, Solomon is looking at like the totality of life. Like when you look at life from beginning to end, from someone's birth to the day that they die, and you look at life taken as a whole, is there some point to be found in it? So let's start here in verse 1 of Ecclesiastes 7. A good name is better than a good ointment, and the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Now, I think we're going to look at a series of Proverbs here in the first half of this chapter that sort of turn our expectations about life upside down. You normally think of the day of one's birth as being a better day than the day of one's death. Like, you don't think of a funeral as being like the high point of a person's life. But it's all about reputation. When you take a person's life as a whole, when you look at the totality from beginning to end, its completion is better than its beginning. So let's talk about why that is. He starts off by saying that a good name is better than a good ointment. And by good name, he doesn't just mean a nice sounding name or a very regal name or a name with a lot of history behind it. He means your reputation, your name, what your name stands for, who you have been in your lifetime, the way you've lived, the way you've represented yourself. A good name, a good reputation is even better than a good ointment. Now, when he talks about good ointment, we have to keep in mind that Solomon is writing this in a time when you couldn't just go down to the corner drugstore and pick up hand lotion if your skin was dry. These were people who lived in a very arid environment where access to ointments and medicines and that sort of thing were just not as easily accessible as they are today. And so while we might take for granted things like chapstick and hand lotion and conditioner for our hair, that was something that was seen as very valuable to them in that time period. So having a good reputation was even more important than having access to an ointment for your skin, conditioner for your hair, chapstick for your lips. It was even more important than physical comfort. Who you are by reputation is more valuable to you than even sitting comfortably. And the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Now, I wonder in what sense that could be true. Perhaps what Solomon is saying is this, that if reputation really is that valuable, if reputation really is that important, then at the end of your life, when you've died and everybody's gathered together for your funeral, you have an entire lifetime's worth of reputation that people will be talking about. You have an entire lifetime of memories and experiences and interactions and relationships and achievements and accomplishments as well. But at the beginning of your life, what have you accomplished yet? I mean, if you look at a one-day-old baby, you take a newborn, what has that newborn really accomplished? Well, you breathed for the very first time. I guess that's something, right? You cried and screamed for the very first time. That's another thing, I suppose. You kicked and wriggled your legs outside the womb for the very first time. But really, at the beginning of your life, you don't have a reputation. You're just a baby. You're a clean slate. And while that is a very exciting thing for a set of new parents and for their family members and for their friends and for the community, that's a very exciting time if you're just looking at reputation, which is the point of what Solomon's saying. If you just look at reputation, a baby has not accomplished anything. And so in the sense of the totality of your life, of what you've done with your life, the day of your death is better than the day of your birth, because at the day of your death, all you have is reputation. All you have is the relationships that you've left behind. What you did with your life. Was it a life that was worth living? Was it a good life? A substantial life? A meaningful life? A life where you took hold of opportunities that God gave to you? And a life where you really seized upon the Word of God and lived the way that you should? Going on to verse 2. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, because that is the end of every man, and the living takes it to heart. Sorrow, he says in verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be happy. It's often stated that funerals help us appreciate our own lives more. Indeed, when we spend time with those who are mourning, when we surround ourselves with those who have experienced an incredible loss in their lives, it puts our own lives into perspective. And I understand some people can go to a funeral and not really have any, not take away anything from that. I get that. Maybe you go to the funeral of a distant relative that you didn't know very well, or you go to the funeral of a coworker that maybe didn't like you very much and didn't treat you very well. And so I understand that not every funeral is going to be some life-changing event. But more often than not, when you go to a funeral, you walk away with a greater sense of appreciation for your own life, your family's life. You walk away a more sober-minded person. You walk away with a greater understanding of your own mortality. It's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, because the living will take it to heart. You don't learn lessons from a party. Parties are fun, and understand that Solomon is not saying a house of feasting is an evil thing, right? That it's necessarily a bad thing or a wrong thing to go to a house of feasting. He's just saying, in terms of what you learn from it, in terms of like what you gain from that experience on an internal level, it is better to be in the house of mourning, where you can learn something and gain an appreciation and gain some perspective. Most people don't go to a party and gain perspective. Like, I've never been to a Super Bowl party and walked away feeling like it was a life-changing event for me. Like, you don't go to a Super Bowl party and then like hug your family a little tighter that night when you tell them good night. But after a funeral, when a loved one has passed away, when you see the way that people struggle with the loss, when they're grappling with their own mortality, the brevity of life, and you really do understand when God says through the scriptures that life is like a vapor. It's here one moment, and in the next it's past. Most of us will probably live to be 70 or 80 years old. Some of us may live a little bit longer than that. But in the grand scheme of things, what is 80 years? It's just a breath. It's here and then it's gone. And so don't waste the opportunity. I know people don't enjoy going to funerals. There's nothing fun about a funeral. It's not a place where you're going to laugh and smile a whole lot. But when you have an opportunity to go to a funeral, take advantage of the opportunity. Go there with the intent of providing comfort, but also seeking to gain something, to learn something, or to appreciate something a little bit better. He says there in verse 2, it's the end of every man, right? You're going to go to a funeral of so-and-so, your coworker, your friend, even a family member. You're going to go to that funeral. And I think invariably you're going to start to kind of process, like, what is my own funeral going to be like? What will people say? What will people say about me when it's my turn to be the one in the casket? When it's my turn to be the one who's got that, that picture up there surrounded by the flowers? What will people say about me when my life is said and done and my accomplishments are all complete and I'm the one being buried in the grave and my soul returns to the Lord? What will people say about me at my funeral? It's the end of every man. You're going to have a funeral one day also. Your loved ones are going to cry over you. Take it to heart. Now, in verse 3, though, sorrow is better than laughter. That seems like an interesting statement, doesn't it? Sorrow is better than laughter. I think laughter makes me feel better. Boy, I sure do like life when I'm laughing. When I have a good reason to be laughing, that's an indication that life is going pretty well, isn't it? I'm watching a funny TV show. I'm playing with my kids on the floor. I've got an inside joke with my spouse. Brothers and sisters in Christ are coming together and having a good time, right? Isn't laughter better than sorrow? Now, what can he mean by this? The word sorrow in this context probably means melancholy or thoughtful sadness. He's not just saying just sorrow for sorrow's sake or being sad for sad's sake. There's a thoughtfulness to this sorrow. Introspective sadness often has a purifying effect on our souls. It sobers us and grounds us in reality. It calms our mind. It engenders self-reflection and moral honesty. The result of melancholy, then, is deeper contentment. Now, I never heard a joke in my life that made me think hard about my priorities. Jokes are a nice distraction, but that's what they are, is a distraction. With this COVID-19 pandemic and all the isolation that we're facing and people losing their jobs and family members who are getting sick, or reading about the experiences of nurses and doctors that we know who are just facing just trauma, just unimaginable trauma. Sometimes our response, our defense mechanism is to just throw jokes out there. And that's okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But the jokes that we tell about COVID-19, or the jokes that we tell about politics, or the jokes that we tell about war, or the jokes that we tell about North Korea, right? The jokes that we tell as a defense mechanism they're never things that make us better people. They're distractions. They're meant to divert our attention away from the reality that is often very ugly and very hard to cope with, and take our mind away from that reality. So laughter's fine. Solomon's not saying that laughter is a bad thing. But you know what's even better than laughter? You know what's even better than a diversion? At least in the long run, as far as who you are and the kind of substantial person that you become. Something that's better than laughter is to have a sober-minded and honest reflection on the ugliness and dangers of life. To be sorrowful. To be sad about things. In the same way that it's okay to laugh, right? It's okay to make jokes. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to laugh. I think we need to accept this very powerful truth that it is also okay to be sad. It's okay to be sad when a loved one dies. In fact, embracing the sadness is part of the healing process. It's okay to be upset about losing a job. It's okay to be upset about what's going on in the world right now. It's okay if the coronavirus makes you sad, or frustrates you, or causes anxiety. Now, I know that we have to cast that anxiety upon the Lord through prayer, that sadness can't be something that we live in forever, but we must move through it to another point. But if you want to be sad, it's okay to be sad. And if you go to a funeral, it's okay to cry. In fact, it's okay to cry a lot if that's what you need. Sorrow is better than laughter, because in the long run, sorrow can be a very powerful healing thing for us. Now he goes on to say in verse 4, "The mind of the wise is in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure." Verse 5, "It's better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than for one to listen to the song of fools." Verse 6, "For as the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool, and this too is futility." In these verses, he's contrasting the wise man and the fool so much that sometimes the wise man doesn't have a joke to crack. Sometimes the wise man doesn't have good news for you. Sometimes the wise man is the one who's bringing the bad news, who has to say something that's disappointing or frustrating or that's just realistic. Sometimes it's the wise man who has to come in and say what everybody's thinking but no one else is willing to say. And it's better to receive a rebuke from a wise man than to just listen to the song of fools. What good is a rebuke, by the way? A rebuke is an opportunity for us to learn. A rebuke is an opportunity for us to grow. A rebuke is an opportunity for us to take the constructive information that's been given to us, the criticism, and to make ourselves into better people, to improve in some area of life, to grow, to mature, to move past some foolishness of our youth. And this isn't the only place, by the way, that Solomon, the presumed writer of Ecclesiastes, talked about the differences between the wise man's rebuke and the fool's singing. There's other passages in the book of Proverbs, for example. Go back in the book of Proverbs in chapter 10 and verse 17. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 17. "He is on the path of life who heeds instruction, but he who forsakes reproof goes astray." Chapter 12 and verse 15 of Proverbs. "The wicked desires the booty of evil men, but the root of the righteous yields fruit." Verse 13. I meant to say verse 12 there. Sorry about that. Now on to verse 13. "An evil man is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, but the righteous will escape from trouble." Go on down to verse 15 now. "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel." And finally, in chapter 17 and verse 10, Proverbs 17, verse 10, "A rebuke goes deeper into one who has understanding than 100 blows into a fool." But then he makes this interesting statement there in verse 6, "As the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of a fool, and this too is futility." I don't know if you have ever gone camping before. Maybe you're not very adept at building a campfire, but one thing that you understand from campfires when you do them a few times is that you can throw a bunch of sticks or leaves or dry grass onto a fire, and it'll make a lot of noise, right? Little twigs and leaves and stuff, they make a lot of noise, a lot of crackling, okay? But they don't produce a lot of heat. So what he's saying there in verse 6 is the laughter of a fool, right? A fool's compliments and a fool's praise. And when a fool comes in and tells you how awesome you are and how amazing you are, yeah, that's got a lot of crackle to it. It's got a lot of sizzle to it. And it may have a lot of bright light, but there's no heat coming off of it. A fire that's just made of a bunch of twigs and leaves and dry grass, yeah, it burns bright pretty quickly and it's got a lot of crackle to it. But it's not a good long-term fire, right? That's not a fire that's going to be there 5 or 10 minutes later. It just burns itself out real fast. And so that's what the praise of fools is like. That's what the song of fools is like, it's a lot of crackle, but no substance to it. Verse 7. "For oppression makes a wise man mad, and a bribe corrupts the heart." So in verse 8, the end of a matter is better than its beginning. Patience of spirit is better than haughtiness of spirit. Wait for things to turn out, right? Before you come to a final judgment about something, let's wait to see how things turn out. And it's really sad, isn't it? That oppression makes a wise man mad and a bribe corrupts the heart. That oftentimes who people start out appearing to be is not who they end up being. Reserve judgment until you've seen the whole thing, right? That's the point of chapter 7. Like I said at the beginning of our study, the point of chapter 7 is look at the totality of life from beginning to end. What do people really become? I think it's a really sad and tragic thing when you look at the way that politicians or athletes or celebrities of one kind or another, right? They begin their lives so innocently. They go out on this journey. They're going to be Mr. Smith goes to Washington. They're going to be the person that changes things, the idealist, the person who you don't drink, you don't smoke, and you kind of keep to yourself, and you avoid the dangers and the troubles of the world out there. But somewhere along the way, they lose track. They come off the rails. They make a little compromise here and then a little compromise there, and then they open the door, just a sliver, just a crack, and they let evil in. The end of a matter is better than its beginning. When you sit back and patiently assess things at the end, wait for things to unfold before you come to a conclusion about somebody, before you come to a conclusion about a matter, before you make some rash decision. See how things play out. Be patient with life. Verse 9, don't be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of fools. And in verse 10, do not say, why is it that the former days were better than these? It's not from wisdom that you ask about this. Verse 10, maybe we could put that in modern vernacular and say, boy, remember the good old days? Whatever happened to the good old days? Remember back in the day when America was America? Remember back in the day when our communities were like this and neighbors could be like that? And remember back in the day when people used to speak like that, or music used to sound like that, or movies used to be like that? Remember the good old days? It's not from wisdom that we ask that question, at least according to Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Why is it that the former days were better than these? Remember the good old days. I think every generation probably has their sense of what the good old days were, right? We think that the good old days, the good old days were the 80s for me. I remember back in the 80s. Those were the good old days for someone like me. I remember back in the 1980s, where movies were good and music was great and cars were awesome. Not so much. Maybe the good old days were the 1950s for you, or whenever it was. It's not from wisdom that we say that, because every generation thinks that they knew what the good old days were. But I think in reality, the good old days were not always good for everybody. The good old days weren't good for everybody. And we kind of have those rose-tinted glasses on when we think about our past or our youth or our hometown or the way things used to be. It's not from wisdom that we say this. The 1950s don't need you anymore. The 1970s don't need you anymore. The 1990s don't need you anymore. You know who needs you? Right now. Today. That's where you're needed. God does not need you reminiscing about the past. God needs you present and aware and participating in life right now. That's where you're needed. And we need to always be really careful about that, not to, just not to think of the past in some rosy-colored way, but to have an honest assessment about what life is like right now and the way that our kids need us and our grandkids need us and America needs us and our congregation needs us and your family needs you and the community needs you, right? You are needed right now, not 50 years ago or 30 years ago. You're needed right now. Verse 11, wisdom along with an inheritance is good and an advantage to those who see the sun. For wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. And I like the comparison that he makes there between wisdom and money, right? With money, you're able to pay your bills and put a roof over your head and do things with your family. With money, you're able to make investments and to try and have some security for the future or your retirement, right? There's a lot of things that you can do with money. And wisdom is a lot like money. Solomon says, though, the biggest difference between wisdom and money is that wisdom is going to last a whole lot longer. Wisdom has the advantage, he says there in verse 12. Wisdom has the advantage of preserving the lives of its possessors. Your life is preserved because of wisdom. Now, there's plenty of dummies out there with lots of money. Right? You can be a complete nincompoop and have millions and millions of dollars just by sheer coincidence. You get an inheritance or a trust fund, or you stumble across some great business idea and you just happen to be the first lucky person to discover it. Right? So there's plenty of nincompoops with money out there. But they might not be right with God. They might not know a thing about how to actually live, how to take care of themselves, how to build relationships, how to have a healthy marriage, how to have a good relationship with their kids. They might not know a thing about the scriptures. They might not have any understanding about eternal things, heaven, hell, the spirit, and our judgment before God. So you can have a lot of money, but that doesn't mean that you've preserved your life in any way. Wisdom is for those who see past the physical world. Wisdom is for people who have the perspective to see beyond just what's right in front of them. Wealth and food and a home and sex and relationships. Wisdom is for people who are seeking after God. So he says in verse 13, right along those lines, consider then the work of God. For who is able to straighten what he has bent? In the day of prosperity, be happy. But in the day of adversity, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not discover anything that will be after him. You think that maybe you've got life all figured out? You think that you understand what life really is? I don't think any of us really know a thing about it until we start considering the works of God. God has so ordained things that what is bent cannot be straightened, that what is straightened cannot be bent, that there are eternal divine truths that God has laid down. One of those truths is you're going to die someday. Unless the Lord comes back in judgment first, you're going to die someday. That's the whole point of Ecclesiastes 7, at least verses 1 through 14. Look at the totality of a life from beginning to end. Who are you? What was that life all about? What were your priorities? What were your accomplishments? You're going to have good days. That's verse 14. There will be days of prosperity. And when things are good, enjoy it. Enjoy it for what it is. In the day of prosperity, be happy. When it's sunny and the weather's nice and it's just beautiful out there and you're young and you're healthy, you know what? Enjoy it. Enjoy it for what it is. But in the day of adversity, consider that God has made one as well as the other. God is not just a cosmic vending machine that just doles out nice things all the time. You put your quarter in and you get something out. And it's always delicious, a candy bar or whatever. That's not how God works. God made this life to be more complicated than that. and we're going to have parties, and we're going to have funerals. And people are going to be born, and people are also going to die. And there are going to be fools who sing your praises, and wise men who rebuke you and offer you the constructive criticism that you need. You're going to see the full spectrum of it in your lifetime. And I think that's true of every one of us. You will see the full spectrum. You will see joy and sorrow. You will laugh and you will cry. You will sin. And you'll also have the opportunity to repent. If you've got a spiritual need, reach out to East Shelby. Let's have a conversation together. Let's talk about the questions that you have about God, spiritual matters, the Bible, or the gospel. And become a Christian. Because until you become a Christian, until you've put on Christ, you really cannot stand before God whole and pure and clean the way that He intended for you. As always, my friends, I hope that you have a blessed and wonderful day. Take care.